when I was in youth ministry 30 years ago, it was okay to go to a church-based youth group if we had something cool on. You could be in the state high school and say, hey, guess what? They got a band on tomorrow night. I'm going to go down to the church because they got this awesome rock band, right? It's now social suicide to go to church for teenagers. People are afraid of religious people, rightly or wrongly. That, we make them nervous as an institution.
Welcome, David.
Thanks, Andrew.
And we're talking about your new book, Being Christian After Christendom. Where are we? How did we get here? What went wrong? What is the solution? Why did you write this book?
I was having many conversations with people in ministry, with people from my church, and they would kind of say, something's happening, this happened, that happened. And I would kind of say, yeah, I think I can explain a bit of what's going on there. And they would say, that's really helpful. Like you should put that in a book. And I just kind of have people saying that again and again and again. And then I would put little snippets on the front of the church newsletter explaining some social phenomena, and people were just kind of saying, pull them all together and put them in. And I had that conversation so many times. I was like, okay, I'm getting the signal. I decided to kind of sit down, approach a publisher, put some thoughts together, and I started writing.
Okay, so you're not just writing this from a purely theoretical perspective. You're a practitioner because you've been in a church where you talk about this is how we've always done it, and it doesn't seem to be working anymore. So tell us about that experience.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Christians and pastors who are anxious. They get that culture's changing. They see that there's less kids in youth group, there's less new people coming to church, that the youth ministry has got more kids from the Christian school and less kids from the state school, and they're just not quite sure why. And so I'm simultaneously trying to do two things. One is, in as simple terms as possible, accessibly explain how has this massive culture shift kind of happened? And then second, how do we disciple and evangelize in ways that now fit with how our culture works?
Okay, so you came to a point in, I think it was a Baptist church in Victoria where you're pastoring, because your background is Reformed, then Anglican, and then Baptist, and now you're back in the pastoring an Anglican church. But you came to a point, I understand, in that Baptist church where you, because your background was in sociology, that there'd been some sociology work about how people get converted anyway. So what did you discover?
Yeah, so I was at a church called New Peninsula Baptist Church, and one of the campuses of that church is called Rosebud Baptist. And if you're from the Baptist world, there's something called the BDC, Building Discipleship Culture, which is coming out of Crossway Baps. Some of what's written there was learnt at Rosebud Baptist. And we had this long-term coaching program where members of our congregation were trying to coach members of the community who were doing it rough. And we just kind of found there was long-term coaching relationships. There was two people who were talking about life, having in-depth conversations, but we didn't quite see as many conversions as what we sort of hoped. And then I came across a PhD in a sociologist trying to explain and track exactly how conversions worked. It wasn't a theological book. He wasn't talking about repentance or the work of the Spirit convicting sin, or he just described the sociological side. And I kind of thought, wow, that's interesting. What about if we start to play with some of that in this coach ministry down at Rosebud? And we did, and we started to have some amazing results.
So some of the sociological things, what actually leads a person to that point, isn't it, where they are then prepared to change their worldview? Now, you give the analogy of someone who is next door neighbours to perhaps the president or the grand poobah of a Masonic lodge. Give us that metaphor and explain how that relates to how we as Christians trying to evangelise are actually not realising the built-in resistance to our message.
Yeah. So everyone in the church has tended to think we're people of faith, the world doesn't have a faith. We have beliefs, they don't have beliefs. We're believers, they're unbelievers. I think that metaphor has passed its useful date, and I think we now need to appreciate that the people of this world, they have beliefs, they have hopes, they have values, they have religious symbols and practices, and they're part of a community where they're telling a religious story, and this story and community reinforces itself, and nobody gives up a religion easily. So I try and use this analogy. You're a Christian, I'm a Christian. I've got a new neighbour, seems like a nice person. Our kids are getting along, they go to the same school, turns out we're in the same footy team. We stand on the sidelines together and we chat, watching our kids play sport. Then on the way home, we go past the Masonic Lodge and we see they've got a fresh coat of paint. They're having a family fun day. We drop in for a free jump on the jumping castle. And it turns out this next door neighbour, lovely family, he's the new grand poobah of the Masonic Lodge. And his wife says to my wife, do you want to come next Sunday for a family gathering? And our answer is no, because we've already got beliefs, we've already got values, we've already got rituals and practices and a community that supports all of that. And without even thinking about it, we just kind of assume that our worldview is plausible, that worldview is implausible. I don't actually need to go and have a serious look. People who have a faith don't just give up their faith. And when we appreciate that the people of this world have a post-Christian version of faith, we need to think more like cross-cultural missionaries about how we approach their belief system that they currently are persuaded by.
Mm-hmm. And that metaphor plays out in some of the belief systems, I assume, in the world, where we have belief systems that have their own eschatology. We have the environmental movement and so on. You talk about symbols. In Christianity, we've got our primary symbol, the cross, but you say every religion has symbols, symbolic meaning. What are some of the? What do you mean? What are some of the symbols that you're seeing are equally religious but are not Christian?
Well, the classic one, of course, has to be the rainbow. So the rainbow flag, if you're wearing that on your shirt or something like, if you go into, say, a counsellor's office and they've got a rainbow there, it's a symbol that means you're going to be loved, you're going to be accepted, you're not going to be judged. It's a symbol that means you're inclusive, we're not going to turn you away if we're a business. So that symbol communicates a whole range of beliefs and values around that. And we feel very emotionally attached to our symbols. We actually kind of have wars or fights over our symbols. Words can be symbols too. It's interesting. You talk about my denominational shifts. I've gone from a Victorian Baptist church where you talk about kingdom to a Sydney evangelical church where you talk about gospel. And if you use the wrong word in the wrong tribe, the symbolic meanings that you're playing with, that people get very, they're wedded to and they're moved by. So words can be kind of symbols as well, right? So acceptance, love, tolerance, they're both values and symbols. Mix those in with the sorts of things that we do sort of, in a footy round where we're wearing Indigenous jumpers, that's a symbol. We're inclusive of our First Nations people, and where other worldviews used to be more judgmental and racist, we're completely the opposite. We're affirming and welcoming, and we want to pay our respects. So
is it that some Christians think that we're dealing with blank sheets here? We're dealing with, the slate is blank, but what you're saying is the slate is not blank, and and we're dealing with people that have all of the elements of what we already have. And how does that present a challenge to us in our evangelism?
I think it means that our evangelism has to simultaneously take place on two fronts. So if you were going to become a missionary in Indonesia or in Cambodia, you would think to yourself, well, what do they believe in Cambodia? They're Buddhists. So how do I talk to a Buddhist about faith? Well, they've got a different idea about God than us, so I'm going to have to approach the topic of God quite differently. But we both have a notion of prayer. So maybe prayer might be a space where we can have more common ground. You know, you will think in those sort of terms. We need to be thinking, what are the beliefs and even the idols of our culture? And how are we going to have conversations where there's kind of connection points and points of difference? So how do we do that? That's kind of part one. And then how do we connect that back to the truth of who Jesus is? Because my view is that spiritualities all throughout history, all over the world, in some ways you could boil it down to there's the narrative of Jesus and there's the counter narrative of Satan. And what Satan is doing is he's telling not complete lies, but usually half lies that are a twist on the truths of Jesus, that are a twist on the way we've been made in God's image.
So Augustine did this in, was it 420, AD 420, with the City of God.
Yes, absolutely.
He's actually describing two cities as two worldviews. And you use the language of worldview as well. You actually talk about a Christian worldview, and you contrast that with a post-Christian worldview. If you were to describe the post-Christian worldview, how would you define that?
Yeah, so I think the Christian worldview was God-centric. God is at the beginning of history. God is at the end of history. He's drawing us to himself, very Augustinian themes. Jesus is at the middle of that history. Whereas the post-Christian worldview, I'm at the center of my universe. It's a story about me. I'm my own director, and I get to make the plot, and I'm my own audience. I tell the story for me. I think that's kind of one difference. And another is we've had a shift, say, perhaps more from thoughts towards intuition and feelings. So rather than looking out to the Bible or out to science or out to nature, actually now I look into myself and make decisions about what's best for me.
So that presents a real challenge for us, because we're talking about a sovereign God who wants to exercise lordship over your life. He accuses you of something that brings guilt and shame, or exposes our guilt and shame. And yet we're dealing with a culture that doesn't start there and is reluctant to even go there. So the question then is there a future for the church? Because many people with a wave of the hand are very dismissive. The church is now irrelevant, but that doesn't seem to be what you're saying in this book.
Yeah, that's right. I think like me with my Masonic Lodge neighbour, there's a lot of non-Christians out there who have dismissed Christianity as implausible, and they're doing that because they've kind of heard that our primary message is that you're a sinner and you need to repent. And we do believe that. But as I kind of look at the ministry of Jesus and Paul, I think they're a little bit more shrewd about their kind of engagement points where you begin a conversation. So if we kind of take Paul in the Areopagus, right? He's not quoting the scripture, he's quoting Greek poets. And he's not beginning with, you guys are sinners. He's actually beginning with, there's an unknown God, you're spiritual. It's good that you're spiritual, it's good that you're religious. Maybe you're a bit ignorant about this, let me try and explain this to you. Does he get to parts where they disagree? Absolutely. He gets to the resurrection, and most people say, you know what, we can't believe in a resurrection. So there are parts of the gospel that are in tension with our culture, but there also are parts of the gospel that are closer, and maybe that's a better entry point for conversations. I think we've got to look for slightly different entry points into gospel conversations than where they naturally fell 50, 60 years ago.
Like what?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we're going to have a season of listening because non-Christians think we don't listen. They see us as judgmental with predetermined answers that we pull out of our back pocket. We give them gospel presentations. Even just the very process of listening is a great thing to do. But I think there are some windows. So, for instance, forgiveness is one. We live in a cancel culture where if you do, one of any number of terrible sins, then we kind of cancel you forever. And I think young people are afraid of kind of being cancelled and don't have mechanisms in the public conversation for how do you forgive and how do you restore relationship. That's a part of the gospel that's kind of unique and beautiful. I think deep friendships that are enduring through seasons where we're not our best. So I think a lot of our friendships are sort of transactional. I'll be friends with you and you'll be friends with me, or I'll be in a relationship with you and you with me, so long as we're both getting something out of it. But actually there are times in life where we find ourselves falling in a bit of a hole, perhaps not our own fault, and we need some long-term enduring friends who will love us even when we're a bit unlovable and we can't quite return the favour. I think our relationships are maybe a bit shallow at the moment and a bit transactional. And just to kind of be there as people go through their shadows of death, I think can be a great, So deep friendship, I think, is kind of another opportunity. There'll be others. Have a read in the book, but there's a couple of suggestions.
Well, then it causes me to ask the question, we're talking about the local church reaching into its community. Are you encouraging local churches to look at what happens in their service as a part of evangelism? Or are you seeing that what happens in the local church's weekend service as trying to achieve something else?
I take it by services you mean what's happening on Sunday from 9 till 11 or whatever the time slot is. Yeah. I think if we can use a distinction of evangelism and pre-evangelism, I think there's going to need to be more pre-evangelism that's happening in a decentralized kind of a way. So just like I'm unlikely to turn up to the lodge, I think lots of people are now. When I was in youth ministry 30 years ago, it was okay to go to a church-based youth group if we had something cool on. You could be in the state high school and say, hey, guess what? They got a band on tomorrow night. I'm going to go down to the church because they got this awesome rock band, right? It's now social suicide to go to church for teenagers. People are afraid of religious people, rightly or wrongly. That, we make them nervous as an institution. And so I think we need to do more decentralized. We need to empower our people to be witnesses out there in the marketplace. And once they've built up some rapport, and once somebody knows 3 or 4 or 5 Christians, maybe that's then the time to think about starting to invite them to church. But they've probably got to be down the pathway with some issues, with some networks, before we're ready to bring them to a week, or before they're likely to say yes to coming to a weekend service.
But should the weekend service, wherever it is on the weekend, should that make any adjustment at all, or in other words, is it a part of the evangelism strategy that you're proposing, or is it something else?
Maybe as opposed to, say, the seeker service, which imagined that there were lots of non-Christians or people who were seeking Christianity coming to church, maybe we think of the church service as a little bit more of a coaching spot for how our people are being disciple makers out there in the world. And we're trying to use maybe interviews and testimonies and our preaching to kind of talk about how to be an evangelist, a missionary, Monday to Friday.
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying that, am I hearing you say that we need to be thinking intentionally about training missionaries?
Yeah, I think we've got to teach our people, how do you understand what's happening in the culture out there, so that if somebody their life's coming into disruption, we'll talk about that in a minute, how do you kind of help them critique what's going on in their life, understand their values and their belief system, so that they might think, actually, it's not quite working. Maybe I should think about another system. We've got to teach our people about how do you begin to have God conversations in a way that doesn't look like you're going through a gospel tract. How do you make that kind of conversational and relational and not confrontational? Because that kind of shuts people down, unfortunately. We've got to teach our people about how do you not just be one person talking to one other person, because that can get dismissed as an opinion. How do you kind of weave a web, because I think we're increasingly appreciating the fact that we hold beliefs as parts of communities. And belief, part of how you bring plausibility is when a number of people believe something. So, you know, if you've got 5 or 6 friends who all believe that Jesus helps them make their family a richer, deeper institution, then you're more likely to check that out than if just one person says that.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent do you think this adjustment that you're talking about is going to cut across perhaps our traditional church allegiances or the way we've always done it? There are perhaps some church growth techniques which people talk about, some of the detail, like the length of the service, the length of the sermon, whether you sit in pews or chairs. Does any of that matter to what we're talking about?
Look, I suspect less and less. I think the view used to be that if you get Sunday right, people will come. But I think increasingly, if you're able to be a loving, caring, listening, engaged person who walks alongside somebody else through their season of disruption, you point out to them, hey, does that work? Because like Jesus works for me in this space. I'm not sure what you're doing seems to be delivering. If you could be that sort of a friend, then I think if they eventually come with you to church, they'll be open because it's working for you.
Mm. So in here you talk about what went wrong, but you also offer the solution. Are you saying that what we used to think, as you've just mentioned, the emphasis was on Sunday, open the doors and they'll come, build it and they'll come. But it sounds like you're saying this generation isn't going to come. So what are they going to do?
So the sociological research you mentioned earlier says that people are wedded to their current worldview until a disruption comes. You need a moment where it's kind of like, actually, my life's broken, right? So I'll give you a story. This is from Rosebud Baptist Church, right? So there's a guy, he's in his mid to late 50s, he's been a successful businessman, has some kind of old school language, some kind of breakdown, ends up in, I think, a psych ward for a month or two, and his friends rally around him and they're supportive, and his wife's there for him. And he never quite gets better. He gets out of the psych ward, but, and then 12 months later, he finds himself back in the psych ward again. And this time, it's too much for his wife. And the relationship breaks down. And most of his old friends side with his wife, and he finds himself disconnected. and I think the house is sold and he hasn't got enough money to buy another house. He's intellectually not capable of holding down and emotionally not capable of holding down a job anymore. He buys a camper and he's kind of sleeping, and so he's sort of homeless. And so he's had a massive disruption, and his old explanations of, if I'm just a nice guy, if I love my wife, if I go to work, that doesn't work anymore. And that's a major disruption. A very small disruption could be, I've met a girl who I really like and she goes to church. So disruptions don't have to be good, they don't have to be bad, they don't have to be big, but something's got to cause a person to say, my old way of seeing the world doesn't explain what's happening now. I need some other explanation. Then stage two, that sounds kind of clunky, what flows from that is somebody who walks alongside you and kind of says, yeah, maybe it doesn't work because these don't add up. Maybe actually filling your own tank first, it never feels like your tank's full. Maybe when Jesus says, actually serve first, and that will fill you, maybe that's true. So there's a season of walking alongside someone, then building a community around them, and that tends to lead to commitment.
Mm-hmm. You say in your book that the post-Christian worldview hasn't worked for people. You mentioned that there are some trends that we can observe, such as that people's personal well-being, although it's a priority, is actually not working for them. You also state that people are looking for freedom, yet you mentioned that there's more fear that leads to a bondage in people. You say that people crave social connection, yet they are more socially isolated, and loneliness, if I could put words into your mouth, is now at an epidemic stage, that there's an epidemic of loneliness. The strength in being strong that they want, you say, well, the result of their post-Christian worldview actually is that they have very little resilience to some of the challenges of life. And the fact that they are certain has actually led to the rejection of absolutes and certainty itself. Mm-hmm. So now they're less certain, and that although they believe the individual is preeminent, they actually have less concern for individuals as a result. And although it's you write here on page 57 that they claim that they are focused on the marginalised, but in actual fact, the rate of people being abused and becoming vulnerable is increasing. So into that space, David, I think you've made a very, very valuable contribution. And I know that Christopher Watkins has written a book that's like 600 pages, and it's been considered one of the most influential Christian books of the 21st century already.
Yeah.
And yet you have written a Reader's Digest version of the same, basically some of the same points. The two cities, the two worldviews, and how the worldview offered in counter contradiction to the Christian worldview actually is demonstrably not working.
Yeah.
David, if someone wants to get a copy of your book, how do they get it?
Look, I've got a deal. If you go to Width and Stock, so if you look for the book and you find the publisher, and you go to the publisher's website, and you type in BCAC, Being Christian After Christian, so BCAC 40, the publisher will give you 40% off. So there's a great deal. So it's available at Coorong, Reformers, Amazon, wherever, but you're going to find your best deal. This is the Dutchness coming out in me. You're going to find your best deal going direct to the publisher and typing in BCAC 40, and we've organised
the coupon code.
As a coupon code.
David, I want to thank you very much for this, and I hope people do get your book. I hope especially Christian leaders get your book, read it, and begin to apply it. So David, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thanks, Andrew.